Oops. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Explicit Measures, episode 37. And we're going to talk about data model objects and modeling activities, which will be pretty good.
I do have an intro.
Let's do some intro stuff. Yeah, exactly. Let's jump in.
So I just want to know what kind of dinner do you guys want to go to? Because I cannot wait for my free dinner. So I think I'm right, but you can tell me if I'm wrong. But there was quite the thread. So
we got some conflicting information. We got some conflicting information.
Not real. I mean, you saw the filter pane in an image and a YouTube clip. So for a background, for those who are not sure, last week we had a conversation about the filter pane and how long it's been in Power BI, both in the service and the desktop. Not as it is now where you could format it, but just some where you could filter the report and page level filter in the service. So I did some digging. It was invalidated by Mike and Seth. So then I reached out to Amanda, and she was able to verify. And actually, Will Thompson, I might have to owe half my dinner to Will.
I think you do owe Will some dinner, or at least a couple of beers.
Will Thompson went through the internet to kind of scope out a video from 2016, and also showed an image of it as well. And Amanda said it's something like it did exist with the capacity to filter the page. So I think that's our first bet that I didn't eat my words.
So I just want to happy Tuesday. Let's get that out of the way. I'm gonna have to go back to our episode and figure out like what your bet was. Just that the filter pane was there.
There was a filter pane in the service and in the desktop back in right after G-Day.
Our original argument was it wasn't in the desktop.
Was not. Yeah, that's what you guys said. It was not.
So here's the thing. Like, are there
or in the service?
I'm gonna have to go back to the episode and actually listen to it because there were nuances here, right? I think what you're saying is it's been shown now via Twitter that we have
isn't that the ultimate validation?
We had a filter pane that existed, but it was for everything, just for the page.
And I think you said
I think it was just for the page.
Okay.
Because remember, otherwise, why would they have introduced slicers that crossed pages?
No, the slicers can't. I'm not going to get into that argument.
I'm just saying. Like I must.
Yeah.
I'll own
well,
up.
So, yeah.
I'll own up.
If
it must have been the initial implementation. Let's choose my words carefully here. Must have been so fantastic. We chose to use slicers and build our own videos.
Yes,
that was because
maybe that's why I believe that they
I'm with you.
At all.
I'm with you, Seth, because I remember us going through and when bookmarks showed up, we we're like, look at this. We can put something on the page and put filters down and hide them, and this is so cool because you can't do this. And this was, 2018. When was
we wouldn't have recreated something that already existed.
Exactly.
Well, no, because it was the black filter pane or the dark gray one where it could only be in italic. So it was like you try to show a user it, but like don't even worry about it because it was so not hidden, but it just was such a terrible experience. This is where it went to when you can actually format it.
I didn't say that.
It was in the conversation. Someone must have. I was probably on the comments.
It's probably in the comments. That's where it was.
Not us.
We didn't say that.
All right. So let me get this straight. On a Tuesday, you choose to greet us with gloating.
Oh boy.
You know how rare this is in my life in general. So
hey, I'll give it to you.
Yeah,
enjoy the moment. It'll never happen again.
I still tell my wife, I'm like, remember what I was right about like 3 years ago?
Oh boy.
Don't forget that.
Amazing. Well, I will concede if there, I have to go back and look at Will's. I looked at the thread. Initially, the thread was leaning towards no, it was not in the service, and then all of a sudden, Amanda pops out with a screenshot of something. But I do think it's quite funny. These screenshots pop out of nowhere, and it's like just the filter pane, and it's just all black, and I'm like,
oh yeah.
I can't tell if that's in desktop or if that's actually in the service. So I'm a little sus of this image snap.
Well, I can tell you exactly what it's going to happen. It's going to be foreshadowing because you said it in the episode. You said you'll be right, but and it won't be technically right. So we'll be invalidated. And that's exactly what's going to happen.
I'll buy you a dinner, Tommy.
I'll get you a water.
I'll get you a water
at the dinner. All right.
Awesome. So today's topic, moving out of our Tommy was right. Introduction, which is awesome. Moving into today's topic fully in for models, measurements. So just talking through some of that. So Tommy, give us kind of an introduction here. Maybe just introduce some of our audience. Some people may not know what a composite model is, and let's just maybe start there. And actually, you know what? This, I believe, was a mailbag
Yes.
question. So maybe we should just straight up, read the question from our listeners.
All right. So I'll read the mailbag and then we'll kind of give the background on it.
Sure,
I'll be
let's
as
do it.
articulate as possible here.
Yeah.
So this is actually from Work Stuff. It says, I am a regular listener and YouTube commenter, and at the start of my journey with Power BI and try to architect a solution that works for our company. My question/topic suggestion revolves around the reuse of DAX measures. I know that composite models are a fairly new feature and allows for the creation of golden data sets, which I can store some core DAX measures. But from what I have seen and various things Marco Russo has spoken about, this adds some latency, so performance can take a nosedive. Other than this approach is the only other option to replicate measures and logic around various models and potentially add more points of failure when it comes to maintenance. Possibly new, soon to be blogged by Tommy, APIs will provide a better visibility what each model hides under the covers.
Yep.
Yeah, and great contest, love listening. So basically the background here is the new feature in Power BI where you can use a live connection to a Power BI data set.
Yep.
You can now basically connect other sources, which was previously never possible. And it's a direct query under analysis services, which allows you to say, but Power BI data set plus an Excel file or plus a manual table, which really allows some much more dynamic features to expand. So the first part of this is that an option? When does that option really present itself? The other part of what Work Stuff said is, what about latency? You can create DAX measures. There's limitations when you use a composite model or direct query.
Correct.
To adding some custom columns, doing what you can do in Power Query. But what are the pitfalls? Does the latency problem when you add DAX measures on top of a data set already? What can that do to the actual report? So if you want to add any more to that, but that's kind of the gist of, I think, the question.
Yeah. So, let's define, again, I'm going to go through and define a couple terms here that we're talking about, just so people who don't understand or haven't really used these things in depth, right? A composite model is a model that is, I think, I'm going to say the definition. You guys correct me if I got it right or wrong. And hopefully Tommy will be right, and I'll owe him a second meal. So the composite model
doesn't happen often. So.
The composite model is any model that has multiple different loading types. It's not necessarily sources. So you could have everything in import mode and multiple data sources, and that's still we would call that just a model. But the composite model is where we have some things in import and some things in direct query. And technically, I guess at the end of the day, a live connection is just a direct query from your thin report to a Power BI data model. And so we have this a live connection or a direct query to analysis services. So you can have basically models of models, right? So I can build a data model in my Power BI file, and that data model can refer to other data models that are already existing elsewhere. So if you imagine, maybe I have a model for sales and I have a model for marketing, right? Maybe I want to pluck some information out of both of those models. And so I can make a third model that kind of pulls data points from either one of those other models. So when we're saying composite models, we're talking about kind of all those different elements together, right? It could be import direct query in the same model, and it could be an analysis services model that's directly querying other analysis services models. Does that sound right, Tommy?
Yeah, that's dead on.
Okay.
So
that's what we mean by composite model pieces. So let's talk about maybe just in general some of the limitations around composite models. Maybe we should start there. Seth, what do you think? Have you done a lot of work with the composite model pieces?
We can start in composite models, but I think there's multiple topics in this question.
Yeah, maybe let's unwrap that first.
So and let's agree on what those are, right? I think reuse of measures.
Agreed.
Which we kind of talked about last week in thin reports, and we can refresh right now.
Yep.
The use of composite models and when and where it makes sense. I think part of that conversation, because the question was geared towards end users is
Mhm.
enterprise sources of data access for business users,
Yep.
right? And then kind of end user engagement and ownership. Like what should we expect that those business people to be doing, or those teams? Because what do they own versus what is another team, called the BI team or whoever manages models, and what do they own, right? Like, and when does that transition happen? And we've talked about that a little bit, as far as like, how do you pro like increase a model to hand it off to somebody.
Sure. Yep.
I think all those are part of this conversation, like, ultimately. So maybe we just start with the initial part of the question and talk about measure reuse,
Okay. Yeah.
and
Start
then
there.
that's going to dovetail into, like, how does composite models interact with that, because there's going to be some breakdowns, right?
Agreed. Totally agree there. So measure reuse. I like this topic a lot. I'm a big proponent of putting measures in a thin report. However, there has not been very many good methods to get those measures out. And let's call it, for lack of a better term, there's this concept of lineage. So I have a data model. I have measures and columns that are in that model. I build visuals, and those visuals consume measures of those models. And so there's not a really good method to see what parts of my data model are being consumed everywhere. And it just gets the problem gets harder when you have 3, 4, 5 reports that are all pointing to the same data model. And so now I have different measures for different models potentially. So how do you guys kind of work through and manage it? My opinion here on measure reuse is, yes, you want to reuse measures as much as possible. The whole reason you're building a model and you're putting measures in the base model is to make everyone calculate things the same, right?
Right.
If we're calculating sales based on a certain date column, and the date column is when we ship the product versus when we receive payment, whatever that is, someone's making a decision about how do we recognize sales numbers on a month by month basis.
Yeah.
So
So
those are like key data points that the whole organization will use.
So I'll use the example of sales, and I'll use a really basic example that
Mhm.
I've seen in the Power BI, the user group from the Milwaukee Chicago user group last week,
Mhm.
which feels like it was 2 weeks ago.
That does.
Maybe that's what I thought was a podcast, but it was a bug group.
Yeah. But your example, Mike, in the demo was a thin model, and it was basically nothing on the report. Nothing, no visuals, no nothing, and then that's kind of what was sent to the service. One example that we've found, and I've used in multiple cases, is you have a golden report and a golden data set, like we'll call it your global sales report, and it's your kind of your basic model, but it has all the measures: your year to date, your
Mhm.
total sales, in the total quantity,
Yep.
your cogs, etc. Everything's kind of in that one report, and that's a report that's used.
Sure.
There's no live connection. That's an import. That's an on-premise data source.
Yep.
When we need to build reports off of it, like let's say we got a request from a certain sales team, like, hey, we're the we do education. We also want one for Europe. There's certain calculations that they use a lot of bookmarks or pre-baked calculations. We'll build a live connection off of that, and we'll use that data source, that global sales report, and we'll bake in the new report using the composite model, like maybe a reference file that they may have, but then also creating the measures, those additional measures
Mhm.
in those reports,
Sure.
because they're kind of team specific. And again, we've talked about this before, developing reports. And again,
Yep.
a lot of these instances have happened because they look at the global sales report, or an example of that,
Yep.
and they're like, we use a lot of bookmarks, and we do comments because we're always trying to find a certain number. Like,
Sure.
well, we can pre-bake that calculation for you in a report. So rather than building, a whole new import model and the same logic,
Mhm.
just build something with those maybe 7 to 10 additional measures. And that's kind of where the web goes, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that has worked well, because with the thin report, you may not know everything you need from the measurement point of view.
Sure.
And then you have to constantly go back to it. So, and then also there's always configuration with the gold data set. So using a
Sure.
gold report at the same time and then building off of that can, at least what we found, is limit the amount of like tinkering on the new ones,
Okay.
so to speak.
Yeah.
Do you see the same thing, Seth?
Um, I think the and we're dovetailing a little, right? Like,
Yeah.
use measures when possible in a thin report where it makes sense.
I mean, I think you should never use calculated columns, right? If you're talking about
No.
So, I mean, that's one of my big no-nos now that I'm looking at any models. I don't really ever prefer to use calculated
But
columns for everything.
So that's on the main model, though.
On the main model, correct.
Right. Composite models start to complicate things because now if you use measures on those objects that you're bringing into the thin report,
Correct.
then you are like hard binding those measures, and they can't be brought up into the main model
Unless you bring the
those
source.
objects.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe that's what he's talking about, which is the challenges around when do you know what's out there. So if you wanted to pull it up, you could.
So I think that's, I would think you would, again, I'm just trying to spitball here just a little bit, right? I think you would only want to bring things into the main model if there's enough users of that information to want to necessitate the work or the effort to bring in those extra tables and bring them into the main model. So, like, if it's just a team of like 2 or 3 people, and I guess it may even be like based on seniority too, right? If your CEO is looking at a report that has a composite model going on, and there's an extra table that he needs in there, well, doggone it, we probably should put it in there so that the model can run quickly and fast for everyone. And that's, they have enough seniority to require the work to be done. But if it's just, if it's just Michael looking at a report and I've added a couple measures that I need for what I want to report on, and it's not a certified data set, it's not governed, it's just kind of like I'm doing it, this is how I'm doing, that does not necessarily make sense to bring in the composite model measures to the main model. And I'd also say, I mean, part of this where I'm having hesitation of doing some of this, and why I like the thin reports to contain most of the report level measures, it gets very confusing when you have a main model that has all the measures you need for every single visual or page in a report. There's a lot of things you do, like I'm going to format this measure so that it can be used to color something, or I'm going to format this measure so that it shows a blank field or not show a blank field based on what's been selected. So there are some like very specific, I think there's like measures that make sense to still live in the report, because if you think about what they do, their purpose is for 1 or 2 visuals or one particular stylizing thing. And I would prefer to see those stylized measures live in the local models or the thin reports, as opposed to having those live in the main report, because it just gets confusing. And then the next person who looks at your main model, you've got all these measures that you don't understand how they work. And the downside of this is when you're connecting to it, I can't see how the measure is written. I mean, I can see the model now, but I can't see the formulas that measure does. So I have a hard time going back through and saying, okay, I see this is just, the total sales is simply a sum of sales. To me, that's very helpful. And, with the documentation or the description field in measures, as hard as it really is a good idea to describe what this field is doing and how it's getting its data together. But I know it's very hard to do.
So a few interesting things there, Mike, in terms of when we're building let's say a thin report or golden data set.
Sure.
Is so important for that owner to organize.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
So, for example, any measure that's used in a thin report, we really say it better be built off a foundational measure from the gold data set.
Sure.
Like and if there's no reason not to use a like a sum in a sense when you're in a additional report or your second report built off of it. The other thing too with the organization, well, you can solve for, let's say you do have those, you selected this, it's a drill through page of measure or the title measure. I don't like using measure tables, but except for selected like things that are in a sense text or descriptive.
Yep, exactly.
So that always shows up on the top, and so
Yeah.
that helps with organization. But using display folders, like you said, using descriptions in the measures, you
Helpful.
better be doing that if you are sending, even for yourself. Like
Oh,
even
yeah.
if you're the one building the reports off the golden data set, but especially if you're building a data set that other people are going to use, there better be some organization to it where it's like base measures, your foundational measures. Most of the things you can do with these measures here.
Yeah.
Here's your year-to-date measures. But having that organization is a huge catalyst in terms of I think success, and also making sure people are using the right things.
Yeah, speaking of the golden data set, right? I think this topic and this question revolves around like I'm the guy in the company that owns the master model, right?
Mhm.
That I want users to use this, but what happens when they start bolting composite things on,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
I can't manage all that. And I like the answer is I don't think depending on what you built the model for, unless it's a business area specific model where they're going to need these other ancillary pieces where realistically like in composite models we're normally just recommending people add in that small table that's going to
Right.
allow them to filter in a different way, right? It's not loading in millions of records into this otherwise, you know, joined model that's
Yeah.
part of the service
Yeah.
because that is where performance hits are going to happen. But I think because this is the realm of like, hey, he's talking scale,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
And especially if you have a model that's supporting multiple business units, like there's a process of discovery and understanding. Like this person may be using this data source, but that may not be something that you're going to pull into the main model.
Yeah.
And I think if we're in that context, right now there's no great way for us to understand all of those other pieces in the thin reports,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it?
No, even with the scanner
Or does
API,
Okay.
that become
S-
available
So I wanted to. This is one thing I was waiting
when
that's
we
for.
start
actually a
doing the
really good
composite?
It's a really
question.
good. So challenges today, right? You can go through a main report and you can kind of interrogate some objects. The thin reports are not very well documented. However,
Right.
You're right.
have you guys heard of? I think it's Michael Kowalski
Yes.
from Microsoft. He is one of the Microsoft team members, and he runs the website Elegant BI. He's very vested in building
Scripts.
tabular objects and things. He just recently released a blog, and I'll put this in the link here. So it's a export report objects. It's a C sharp
Oh, yeah.
script that runs inside Tabular Editor. So basically, you go to GitHub, get his C sharp script, and you basically point his script. Again, it doesn't require Tabular Editor. It's only using Tabular Editor to execute the script. But the C sharp script is then going into the Power BI file, thin or not thin report, and interrogating all the objects. And I haven't played with it yet, but it looks like a really interesting option. So
Yeah,
here's
export Power BI objects.
yeah, so it basically you point it to a folder of objects and it will yeah, you found it, Tommy.
Oh,
There you go.
yeah.
Um here is the link. I'll put that in the chat window. Tommy got it for YouTube. So this link is basically him going through this is the article that he talks about and he goes, "Hey, in order to get all the objects out of the all the reports, thin or otherwise, use this C# script and it will then allow you to export um, anything and you can dump all the data into a single folder. So basically it
Mhm.
will give you everything you need. This is really helpful because it outputs report filters, the pages, page filters, visual filters, all the visual objects, any custom visuals that you're using, all the bookmarks, all the connections. So he's going back through and he's actually parsing out the PBIX file and giving you an extract of all that information. So I got to spend more time. I have it looks really promising. I haven't quite spent enough time to like get into uh, using it myself, but it seems very interesting.
Well, you raise an interesting point because as I've been diving into the scanner API, um,
Uh-oh,
Oh,
we lost
we
your
just
audio,
lost
Tommy.
you. Lost you.
Tommy, you got to be careful with that
All
mic.
right. Well, while Tommy figures out
This-
his microphone, it'll allow me to talk. And that's awesome that you found that tool, right? And I think it definitely does deserve some discovery, and us probably doing an episode on it, right? To see
Most
whether or
likely,
not it meets all
yes.
those needs.
Yep.
But I do think that's only like it's one awesome, right? Like we potentially have a way to interrogate this. We
Yes.
can add that into a process.
Yes.
But I do think that this also falls into podcast 34 around IT data sets versus user data sets and having a process that is well defined within the organization that allows business users to know, like, even if they have to do this temporarily,
Yeah.
what is the path to get this to a main model,
Yep.
right? Or what is the who do I need to talk to about what I'm doing, if
Yes.
especially if I kill my model
The
and slow
process of
things
it.
down.
Hmm.
And at the same time, like, while using this tool to understand models and what they're doing, you know there's a part of that that could be who's chewing up my resources, right?
Yes.
And And that's where the conversation with whoever that owning team and the business unit needs to be, from the standpoint of you either need to accelerate this or pay, like, you own more of like the costs of this capacity because your resource is now chewing up a quarter
Right.
of what we're doing. Hey,
Exactly.
welcome back. Welcome back, Tommy.
Hey,
You can
yeah.
have your
That
point.
was a little scary.
So I would agree with you, Seth, and I think partly here too is if you open up models. So there's a couple things here I wanted to make a note here. One thing I thought was interesting was, especially when we're talking about building measures and models, um, Power BI allows you to have implicit measures on models. So you can just grab a column that's a number and drop it onto the page. I guess one of our main guidances would be to not use that. If you're building reports or you're building data models, you want to make sure people are not using implied measures. However, I think an interesting maybe tidbit here is when you're using calculation groups, if you turn one on in a model, there's a flag that is set inside the Power BI data model that automatically turns off all implicit measures. You can't have nothing that's implicit. So there's another part of this too is I think your main data models probably should have that flag turned off. And I don't, maybe someone can quote me in either LinkedIn or YouTube of what that flag or that value is, which you can switch inside Tabular Editor. But there's actually a setting where you can say this model will not accept implicit measures, and I think that's actually something you want to turn on, especially when you're going to have a lot of other people consuming your data model, because you want them building measures to do what you want, as opposed to just having implied measures across the model using them in visuals. It's harder to track, I think, that way.
Question: since I did lose audio for a little, did we talk about too the credentials you have to give someone in order for them to view a composite model?
We did not.
Okay,
Talk about
so
that one.
here's the other thing too, and I'm sure this kind of, as we talk about IT, and from a governance point of view, right now, if you were to actually get someone to view a composite model in the service, not necessarily, it has nothing to do with building,
Yep.
but you have to give them build rights on the gold data set.
Correct.
So technically, they could open up Power BI Desktop, download it for free, as we've talked about before.
Yep.
Great feature. And they can just go to Power BI datasets, connect to it without any issues at all, no matter what the actual import data sources are, and do whatever they want with that. And they don't need to even publish to the service. Anytime they open that desktop file, it's going to be up to date.
Sure.
Which right now, there's no way to restrict that. Now, usually a lot of people that you're giving the composite model to, they're not going to think to do that or know to do that, but you are open, that door is open.
Sure, exactly.
So, which does provide a lot of security, because now if it's not published to the service, you can't see what people are looking at or building.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, this is not talking like we'll call the old term of shadow IT, right? You're able to pull things out of models. I mean, you technically you could connect to it to Excel and dump tables of information out and be using that offline if you needed to without that build permission turned on. So that's kind of a condition that you're talking about there. You need that at least on the data set. That's another interesting point, because you in some cases you actually want to restrict those data sets to, well, you can only look at it online. It only comes through PowerBI.com or whatever, governed, I'm going to call it governed reports that come off of that data model.
So let me ask you guys a scenario and see, I want to hear what you guys think, which one's worth it. So imagine you had your gold data set where you had to build a lot of other sources off of, more or less the same idea in terms of like your SQL, the total sales, and you had to supply this on scale for a lot of users. The other option is you really have, in a sense, two competing import data sets, more or less the same relationship from the base, more or less the same measures. Which one is, in a sense, we'll call it worth it, or which one's kind of the better option? Because we've had a scenario like that in the past where you have two reports that are almost showing the same thing, where we either consolidate the reports or maybe we just build a thin one, but they have certain different purposes where it's like, why don't we just consolidate it? But again, then you're building all these other things off of this where you can run into those problems. But we have to make sure, because people look at both of them, you have to have the same refresh schedules, because people need to know they're looking at the same thing.
Correct.
Again, if there's anything built off, they are completely independent of each other. So where does the diverge go in terms of using the composite model, using the gold data set and the thin reports compared to having two data sets that are nearly identical but need to be separate?
I think this begs a really good question. Um, Two thoughts I think I have on this one. And the first thought I would say is really around if there is data that's so common, you better darn well sure that you're pulling the exact same information for both tables, right? Because nothing's more frustrating at the end of the day when you
Yeah.
get to two reports that have two different numbers with virtually the same filter context.
Because one's using implicit, one's using explicit.
Exactly. If your source is a SQL server, then I would guess that most of your dimensions are coming from the same SQL views. So that would be one thing I would be looking at to make sure we have that.
Right.
And so something you could do, right? So you're in some cases, right? If you have, let's just again, I'm spitballing here, right? I don't know what exactly your use case is, but let's say you have 5 dimensions and you have one fact table. And you have 2 of these, right? Maybe the fact table is slightly
Right.
different on a different table or whatever that may be. What you're doing in the service is, which is less of an issue now than it was before, but you're basically duplicating all the data for those 5 dimensions twice. You're loading each table 2 times.
Mhm.
From an efficiency standpoint, that's not very efficient. A better model would be to have all 5 dimensions in one report and then potentially 2 fact tables that would be able to point to those various 5 dimensions. So from an efficiency standpoint, I like the idea of being able to consolidate the models down as much as possible. And I mean, I prefer to have breakpoints where like the subject matter is legitimately different, right? There's a fact table that does not blend well with all these dimensions. I'd rather have more fact tables in one data model that share dimensions so that we get that consistent experience. And so I would opt for try to merge the model down to one. And maybe I'll put a little star or asterisk with that is only if the audience is large enough that it requires that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So we were talking in our user group, and one of the people from, I guess Alex was talking to us about large data models. And when you have
Oh.
one mega model, which is really large, sometimes you need business units or sales teams for a single client to have just a copy of the data for them to report on to the client. So there's this concept of like, well, you could take a large model that would maybe be 60 gigs in size or 50 gigs in size, a big model for all customers, and then you can repeat that model and only add filters to individual clients, and you can give that to a specific team. Because it's so to your point, Tommy, right? If you have a lot of people hitting the same model, you need a very large analysis services machine
Right.
to keep that model up and fresh. And I mean, Seth will argue this, I think, all day long too. Not every client or not every customer of your business is paying you the same amount of money. So there are always premium level customers in your BI space. If you're giving them reporting out of Power BI, they're going to pay you top dollar. That you may give them the premium experience. They may get their own data model because they're larger and they're a valued customer, but their needs may not be the same as the rest of your organization. So that would be maybe my 2 thoughts on that. Like, I think I would prefer to consolidate it.
When you say same data, like,
Yeah.
is it literally the same data with the exception of a few things?
Let's say for the argument, yes, it's more or less the same data, just showing very different things, but it is the same data. It could be because of people coming at different times. It could be because of different teams, but you get this scenario.
So you're looking
So I think
like roughly like sales by some dimension, right? Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah.
Someone may have a different dimension. The 2 models might have a slightly different dimension in them,
a few different dimensions, maybe,
but
one
the fact
updated
table is
view,
basically
yeah.
the same.
The fact, base
Yeah.
fact tables.
Man, this is where like perspectives would be. It sounds like they like it's a good fit. It just
a good
not
point.
supported if you're in the Power BI straight realm. Analysis services still supports it, to go that route. Can you RLS it?
I thought perspectives did work in desktop.
No, the only thing that
you
works
just
with
can't build on
perspectives is personalized
specific-
visuals.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's a
Yeah,
single,
yeah.
So you
It's
can't-
not. It's not global. Like,
You can't connect
is
to
there
a
a way
data
you
set.
can row level security it?
I mean, that I wouldn't say that would be the issue. I think the issue is just consolidating 2 reports where
Right.
you have the same thing. But
I mean,
even,
in our realm, right? Like it's I guess it's 2 different points. One is can it be? Can these can it be a unified data set that you just figure out how to pull in the different dimensions and then use them for different purposes? And if that road is longer, is is there a need to support two different models? And if there is, there's a cost associated to that
Right.
that the business needs to understand, and it needs to make a conscious choice that yes, we're going to do this for the interim period, but the path forward is consolidation, and that's going to take X amount of work.
Right.
That's true.
If there's no way to use what's in Power BI specifically to support both those methods, I guess is my
Right.
point.
Now, because I think it's not so much the security. I really think it's the scale and the performance that the question kind of lies on. To me, that's where my focus would be. You may have these reports that you could easily consolidate, but the thing is, now if you have 7 reports off of this, you have this consolidation where everyone's viewing it. I don't know how many tests. I think Chris Webb did a test on premium per user and the capacity and performance.
Yep.
But you're really now dealing with performance, issues if everyone's are hitting these reports.
Your
that are
measures also
using the
need to be
same
written
data
well
set.
too. I mean, you can't.
Yeah,
So I mean, again,
and
you're looking at like if you're looking at performance and stuff, like you can't have junky measures in there because
no,
when you
and
start,
visual performance, you
yep,
better
and
be using your top 50 or top 100,
yep,
by default, because you're going to run into these issues. Even on, in a sense, these two new consolidated reports, much less anything that's built off, the continual build off.
yep, makes
So
sense.
I think, and I don't know how many. I know, like I said, I think Chris Webb did a test, like has done a few performance tests,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know. I don't know how extensive these tests have been. So if you do consolidate it, it would be very hard to go back, especially if you start running into real performance issues. And listen, so
And the only other thing I can think of here, and we've been talking about measures and where they live. One of the topics we've been also talking about was this composite model piece. I think the composite model also has a limitation. If you think about what has to happen between how you're joining data between two live connected Power BI data models, so model of models kind of thing, you have to be able to take elements out of one data model and hand it through the query engine to the other data model. Just for example, if you have a dimension in your sales table that is customer, and you're linking that to another data point in a different data model that is manufacturing or something like that, a manufacturing number, you have to list a distinct list of those customers and pass it between the two different models in order to resolve a visual that is taking data from two different models. So there's a performance part there, and what you don't want to be doing is you don't want to be passing, I don't know, thousands of IDs between data models, because that just slows things down a little bit. I think in a basic, in principle, it makes sense, but in reality, if you're doing things that are cross filtering between two different models too much, you have a performance degradation there as well. So I haven't really pushed a lot of companies down the let's go make a bunch of composite models. I think in some cases it'll work very well, but I think you have to be very cautious. And actually, I think we were in our user group meeting on Tuesday last week. We had contractors saying we put anything that uses composite models into a sandbox. I think that was Kevin who was talking about that. He was like, we put it all. If you can build it, you can do whatever you want with it, but we're going to limit the scope of where that goes out to until I can fully vet and test it and decide, do we really need the composite model, or can we just push those objects into the main model and just use one model? And I think that's a good approach, because you don't want to be pushing something out there that's everyone loves and all of a sudden it becomes a massive issue, and then now you have to rebuild it. I mean, wouldn't that really be the approach though? The development cycle, right? Start with the main model, play with it in a composite model to figure out what other data you need, figure out if it works, test it with some QA. Yeah, this works. Okay, value added. Let's go back and migrate these objects into the main model now, because now we have a path to go. We now know what we need to build. We just got to add it into the main model.
That's a discussion point, right? Like you built it off a main model,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, exactly.
In a larger enterprise scenario, like maybe the use case is not going to be added into the main model, and a separate smaller model for your use case needs to be spun up and used.
That's a good point.
Where that is part of the solution.
That's
right?
another good point. Yeah.
Maybe you have a little data mart that handles your stuff, right? And then I guess the other point, there's another element to this, right? Like we're talking a lot of the models, but if there are enterprise sources of data access, right, that's where that becomes easier, because you could replicate the pieces that you would need from the main model and just pull for your business unit, or carve off, because this is deemed a separate use case that they don't want to bolt onto the main model. So you have a lot of options, provided those end users have access to that data set.
Good point.
Albeit you don't want to start spooling up the same size of data sets everywhere. Say same size models everywhere.
The more we have this conversation, the more I'm really leaning towards, that approach where you really do start off with like a gold data set and consolidate more of your reports, because the cost, from us, performance, scalability, some security with the build, but that's only if the composite model. If you're live connection, then you don't have to worry about it. But when you think about where this report's using the right dimensions, and they're updated, again, if you're using it from a user build, if they're using data flows, or if there's a view that changes, or if there's logic that changes, that's updated in one data set. The measures are, everything that you need from a foundational measures. The benefit there, and they refresh at the same time, which is also a point of contention. If you have 5 reports that are more or less the same data, but they all have different refresh schedules, people will look at that. Somebody in the organization will find one number that's not right, even just because it was refreshed an hour ago.
Yep.
And one was refreshed today. So these types of things, I think those are the huge benefits. And the more we talk about it, the more I think about it, the more, to me, it really outweighs, I think, some of these potential performance issues, because I think there's some, like we've talked about, there's some hacks we can do where we can do like top 50 on a bar chart, or like on a table. And we can have it, if you need that table view, just go to, in a sense, the import model. It's just kind of more or less almost like an audit trail, so to speak.
Sure.
So
you make a good point.
That's an
and
idea.
Maybe
an audit trail.
No, well, I mean, sometimes maybe the latency is worth it.
Yeah.
We strive for performance, and I love how we've created an atmosphere where like people can click a button and it instantly shows up, right? But the reality is there's a lot of reporting tools out there where you wait.
You chew.
Right?
Yeah.
So
the data just hangs.
Maybe it's worth the additional latency, and it's not one of those situations where we can perfect it because we're okay with the composite model. We obviously, I think, in a realm where we're constantly trying to optimize and make things as fast as possible for a better user experience. But at the same time, does the functionality of the composite model, where we've added flexibility into a business user's life to be able to take a main core set of data that's 95% of the volume and the data, and bolt on something, and their report's a little slower.
Yeah. I would love to see a decision tree being built for an organization from this, because I feel that's kind of what's needed with these different scenarios. Like, are you using the same fact table, like the same base data set? Yes. Do you need something just one off of it? Because that would be needed for an organization for each.
Yeah. But that's, like, to me, that's part of the adoption framework, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of the things we were talking about, or part of your process of what is a data set that comes up and gets promoted through, an IT driven data set. We say IT, or, more of a total business data set versus your unit. And what are the paths? I would say that probably belongs in there. What is that decision tree, and where does it fall out? Because the organization is going to pay for it in one way or another. Either it's going to be dollars or time, right? Like they're going to wait a little bit more, or maybe they spool up multiple different models that contain the same data.
I would love to do a word cloud from all of our episodes so far, and to see what kind of floated the top, because I think process maybe that and Matthew Roach maybe our number 1 and
game
2
changer.
and game changer.
Game changer is probably pretty high up there too. We'll have to go wordsmith all these things together. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic, and I think this is, I think there are some guidelines that are out there, but I think we're still seeing like larger organizations still learning through some of this as well. I think there's still some knowledge that's being handed out to us, because this is relative. Composite models, or a direct query to analysis services models, is kind of a newer thing. It hasn't been around that long, so they're still trying to continually performance tune it, adding features to it to make it faster for us to use and consume. So
let me ask. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say either way, this is the fun part, I guess, for me is, thank you work stuff for the question.
Yeah.
Now you can rail on us. Did we answer it, or you still have it, or at least provide some insights, right?
Give the consulting answer.
Right.
Well, it
it
depends.
depends. It
So,
depends.
it depends. So let me ask a kind of we'll call it a closing question, but for you two to really start full on using composite models with using direct query analysis services, what are some of the things that Power BI is going to need to add to the feature set, or kind of what walls need to break in terms of for you to say this is the primary approach moving forward?
So I think I'm looking for from in order for me to kind of right now I think I'm looking at the composite model piece and direct query to analysis services as more of a special case, right? It's not something I'm going to develop enterprise models on top of. I think there is some feature set around making sure that when I'm handling lots of dimensions or lots of key values between two different models that we have almost again, I can't assume that's always going to be exactly the same performance, but comparable performance, right? We realize that you may have a slightly slower analysis, or it might be slightly slower. So within reason, right, allowing me to have kind of n number of key values passed between two different models, I think is one thing that would be a feature that I'd be looking for to kind of give more of a stamp of approval to put composite models more into production. I really do think composite models right now are more of these edge case things, right? It's more business user centric than I'd be going out and starting to say, all right, we're going to be an enterprise and we're going to build composite models for everything. I don't think I would lead with that yet. That'd be maybe my perspective. Seth, what do you think?
I just don't know if we're gonna get there. I mean, the flexibility of performance is a big one, right?
Yep.
And the one that I hadn't thought about before you brought it up, Tommy, was the permission sets. I mean, to have to elevate somebody's permissions to go view reports based on composite models, like if it slows down the use of them, it's probably a good thing, right? Like you don't want a ton of composite models in the wild unless those performance things are addressed. But at the same time, that flexibility, it's huge. It was a huge ask, and now that it works against the live data set in Power BI service, it's been there for a while in AS, but it opens up capabilities, right? And that's what I think they're trying to do is unblock people. I think there's some due diligence I need to do now that there's a potential tool, right, out of Elegant BI, and invest a little time in there and in building a solution that is monitoring where those are being used, how that fits into a promotion path, and how the organization wants to manage those types of models. Because, like I said, it's going to be slower, or you have a path to rectify and not have a composite model that's taking a long time to render things. I don't outside of that, it's hard for me to, I guess, think of any other additional features that would be required. It was a huge win that it's out there.
Yeah. I'll complete the triad of needs because both of what you said, I completely agree. Performance, security with the build. And then the last thing is from the scanner point of view, knowing what other data sources are going to be used or can have the insight into that. But I think
I would agree with that one too. I think this kind of convolutes a little bit, or it makes it harder for you to discover like what's really happening with your data models. And I think there's a couple tools out there that'll help us with that, but they're potentially more effort for you to figure out what's going on. So if you turn on a model to composite models, right, you can turn on the Azure audit logging for analysis services models, so that way every query that comes across the wire, you can look at every single query, and so you technically you can watch everything that's happening at the model level. But if you're at a very large model and there's a lot of people hitting it, you have a potential for a lot of information. These queries are very large, multiple kilobytes, tens of 20s of kilobytes in size, because these are large data queries that are coming back to the analysis services engine. So you just be aware, like you can get to it, but potentially there's a lot of data to weed through in order to get to an answer that you need. So I think in the same way we're having the problem with thin reports to main model reports, it's just another layer to that as well. So now we have another layer of like, well, how does all the lineage work from the main model to the composite model? now to the reports and the visuals. So now I need a better. I think the tooling's getting there. I think people are starting to say this is a problem. We're going to figure it out. That's where you're seeing Michael Kowalski's C# script come out and say, hey, we can rip apart a file for you and show you all the elements that are there so you can see them. So I think we need more of that, and I hope we'll see what happens, but I hope Purview is kind of one of these things where we could see without a lot of I don't want manual effort, right? I want it to just figure it out. I want to be able to click on a model and I want to see like a tree. I want to be able to click on the main model and see, oh look, we've got 3 composite models living off this in the service. Here's their workspaces. And then when I click on those models, I can say, okay, this composite model has 3 reports on it, and I can see all the measures down to the visual level of what's going on in those reports. So it's a lot of data, I know, but I think if you're going to accurately manage these things, I think you need that level of information from a governance standpoint.
Being the guy who loves admin, I can't believe I didn't think of it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Like this isn't a matter of controlling, right? It's a matter of understanding. So it's fantastic that functionality exists, but in larger scales, absolutely, right? And Chris Wagner joined us on YouTube. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Is agreeing with all of Mike's points, because you can't. How do you manage? Like, we're having this conversation around the challenges of composite model, what it's going to do to reports, and end users don't know that. End users don't know what they're doing, what sort of resources they're sucking, or why their report is so slow. And it's going to require those people in the units or in the know to understand that it's happening, one.
Yes.
And 2, figure out how it's supposed to be directed, and then how do you resolve it if at all possible, right? And that's a lot of the implementation things that are helping business users, I think potentially are hurting companies though, right? Because just because you're opening up these doors doesn't mean they're great.
Exactly.
You need the people who are managing all of it to understand the ecosystem, what's happening in it, so that visibility is paramount.
The data source may be endorsed, but the guy who's building it is not. So.
That's everything I do.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think this has been a really good topic. And again, I hope we answered the question. I'm going back to just briefly the question here at the very last part. I want to wrap up with one other kind of thought here. They said, kind of one of the key questions of the comment from Work Stuff was, what are the points of failure when it comes to maintenance? And I think at the end here, I think we've done a good job of kind of talking about those are some of the weaknesses. We have less visibility as to what's happening and what is the lineage of all these data points and how we can trust the data. And I think if we kind of really distill this down to like what some core concepts are, right? We are putting data together that people have to trust. And at the end of the day, it's all about trusting what you're seeing on a page. So as long as we can all kind of agree about the level of trust that's happening here, at that core level, the trust of what you're building here, you can't have a bunch of these off the cuff calculations and things that are giving you different numbers all over the place, because people will stop trusting your data. And that endorsement of that trust and maintenance of that data set is very important for kind of success of whatever you're going to be building, right? If people are finding no value from your report or they can't trust it, then they're just going to move on to something else and go back to Excel or doing data dumps again and building their own analysis on top of it. So I would say
good discussion.
I would say if you can, try and push as many things as you can back to the main model, right? Push as much stuff as you can to your one source. I think it's easier to manage from a governance standpoint. And then we'll see what the tooling provides in the future, right? That would make this easier to handle and manage thin reports and other composite model type things. Well, with that, we're going to kind of wrap the episode. Thank you all very much for attending or listening to Explicit Measures. You can find us on all the major social media channels. We're on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitch, Facebook, and Periscope. If you want to find us somewhere, feel free to watch live. We do this every Tuesday and Thursday. And our only ask is, would you share this with someone else who you think might find this valuable as well? So if you got a kick out of this, if you learned something new, if you felt value from this, if you're at work, at the water cooler, you're talking to somebody else, please just share this conversation with them and let them know, hey, I listened to this interesting podcast. It was helpful to me. Go check them out. Here's the link. And then Tommy, where can we find the podcast, either podcast or video?
Yeah. So one thing off what you said, Mike, too, this entire episode today was off of a mailbag. So
That's
if
exactly
you want to
right.
join the conversation or suggest a topic, do it on YouTube comments. Go to Power BI PowerBI.tips. There's a podcast page on Twitter. So suggest a topic you want us to talk about. We're available on Apple, Spotify, anywhere a podcast is available. If you're listening to this, you can watch it online on YouTube and LinkedIn. And if you're watching it, you can listen to it on any podcast platform.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much. Awesome conversation. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you on Thursday.